Thank you for the introduction. Thanks everyone for joining us at iSchool Insights. My name is Hidy Kong, and today I'll be presenting Trust and Bias, Guiding Communication Through Visualizations. So here's a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll do a quick introduction of the topic, then I'll be delving into two of my previous research projects, one on infographics in public health, and another on visualization web tools for clinical communication. And then I'll be presenting my ongoing and future work. So to begin, the amount of data collected and stored by individuals and organizations is massively increasing. In fact, many of you might have been collecting data while you were walking into this room, whether you're aware of it or not, probably through your smartphones or smartwatches or other wearable devices. So with this massively growing in amount and frequency of data collection, what are we doing with all this data? So researchers have looked into ways to both use and look into this data in an efficient and effective manner. And one of the key ways that they've done that is through data visualizations. So when I say data or data visualization, what type of data comes to mind or what words? Most of people would say quantitative data or numbers, right? So numeric data is a dominant part of many data visualizations, whether that number is number of steps you had to take to come to this presentation, or maybe duration of exercise, if you had any exercise for the day, or maybe calories in a cup of coffee, or the number of people in this room, right? All of this is numeric data that we can be collecting. But we not only generate and collect quantitative data, we also collect qualitative data all the time. For example, this talk, I believe, I hope, is being video recorded on Zoom, right? So that is one type of qualitative data. Or maybe you do a user study and you collect text data through open-ended question on a survey, or you audio record a session, or you go into a clinical session and you take an MRI scan or maybe some pictures. Those would all be qualitative data. And they haven't really gotten as much attention as these numeric data. So I'm going to be talking about both the quantitative and the qualitative aspects of visualization today. And to do that, I'll be starting out with a pretty simple quantitative data visualization. So this is showing the average delay in minutes for different airlines that you see on the x-axis. And you see the arrival delay in light blue at the top part, and then departure delay towards the bottom in dark blue. Okay, so I'm gonna take a second to look at it, and the first thing I see is JetBlue has quite a bit of a delay. I don't know if that reflects your experience, and the title points that out, right? JetBlue is the most delayed on average, underperforming even Spirit. There's some nuance there, right? When they say even Spirit. And another thing that I noticed is Alaska is pretty punctual. They do good. They don't have a lot of delays. Another interesting thing that I found was when you look at the difference between arrival and departure delay, Delta has kind of average departure delay, but not a lot of arrival delay. And I have to think about that. I'm like, how do they make it happen? I think maybe their pilots are in a rush and they're like, I have to get there on time, right? Because we care about arrival delay. So there are many things that we can get out of a simple bar chart. And the most of the focus is on the quantitative elements, right? How many minutes has it been delayed? But we also have qualitative elements on this chart. For example, the title, right? Once again, it's kind of nuanced, right? It's trying to maybe say something about different airlines, or maybe the source. A lot of the times, these type of visualizations also come up with annotations. So these are all qualitative aspects. How about visualizing qualitative data? So here's an example of a chart that kind of looks like a heat map. And what it's doing is it's visualizing a summary of volunteer interviews, where each column represents one volunteer, and each row is showing one aspect of the volunteer experience For example, the top row is volunteer recruitment, then training, then meetings and supervision, etc. And whenever a volunteer said, "Huh, we're doing great in this aspect," it would be blue. If we need some improvement, it would be red, etc. So it's showing you an overview of what the interview data looks like without really delving into the specifics. And it does give some example quotes. So you can think of this as a qualitative data visualization in a sense. Here are two common ways to visualize audio data. One is by volume or amplitude, how loud it is, and one is by pitch or frequency, so how high or low the pitch was at a given time. So once again, there are ways to visualize qualitative data, but we really haven't spent a lot of our research time on it or ways to create these. So I'll be talking a little bit on that as well. Overall, data visualizations have been used both to explore and to explain data. As I mentioned with the bar chart example, right, you can be performing some kind of analysis. Which airline should I choose if I don't want my flights to be delayed, right? That is kind of analytical side. But we can also use it to communicate data. And that's actually what I'm going to be focusing on today, the communicative role of data visualizations. So that's a little bit of introduction to my research. And today I'll be presenting two of my previous research projects, one on public health infographics and another on visualizing behaviors during autism pre-screening sessions. Before going into these particular projects, I want to distinguish the terms infographics and data visualizations, because people often confuse these terms and use them interchangeably. Right? What does this mean? Maybe we call these data visualization. This is another data visualization. And they do kind of do similar things. They both visualize using graphical, right, elements, some kind of information. But infographics tend to be more comprehensive. So they often look at different perspectives of a given topic. It may or may not have a data visualization in it. So oftentimes infographics are more of a standalone, while if you use data visualization for communication, you would embed it in maybe an article or a paper, so it has other contextual information along with it to present the data. As I said, right, infographics may contain one or more data visualization, but not the other way around. So hopefully you kind of get a sense of what infographic and data visualization are. So with that, I'll be presenting my work on Share Northwest, which stands for Solutions in the Health Analytics for Rural Equity across the Northwest. And Northwest here is Pacific Northwest, so it mainly dealt with 4 different states: Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And my role in this project specifically was to look at the public health infographics side. And it was a multi-institutional study, so I collaborated with my students at Seattle University. I also collaborated with a number of nursing and clinical faculty at different universities. And we had 2 main goals. The first was to understand the practices and preferences of public health professionals when using infographic. And the second one was to create and evaluate a public health infographic tool. So you can kind of think about this as a 3-phase study where number 1 is the first phase, and then the creation is the second, and evaluation is the third phase. Before going into this main study, we actually wanted to survey the land of public health infographics. What are people doing right now? What type of infographics are there? So for that, we collected over 1,000 public health infographics and categorized them. We actually extracted a bunch of information, but I'm only going to be presenting the overall categories here. And what we found was, in fact, a lot of them, in fact, most of them, say 56% of the infographics that we analyzed had some type of statistical data. And you'll see that statistical appears twice. That's because some of them represented statistical data in just text numerical form by making it bigger or changing the color. Other people had a graphical representation as data visualization, maybe a bar chart, or oftentimes pie chart, donut chart, etc. So there were some statistical or quantitative data involved in these infographics, but we also had other common categories of infographics. For example, list infographics. As the name says, is just a list that has been embellished by either a shape, icon, or an illustration. We also had explanatory infographics. These were those that really dove into a specific topic, oftentimes a disease, and it would talk about the definition, it would talk about the symptoms, how do you diagnose it, or what are the treatments, right? And oftentimes they didn't have any quantitative data associated with it. Here are some less common categories of infographics, including geographic, structural, process, and timeline. And here I'm presenting them as a separate infographic, but most of the time we found out that infographic contains several categories, right? So you might have seen these really, really long scrolly type of infographic on social media that like never end and you still keep on going through. So those type of infographic could have a section on geographic and then a process and then some statistical data. And that's why you'll see that if you add it up, these percentages, it's over 100 because a single infographic could have multiple categories. So now we had a kind of a sense of what public health infographics looked like. And so we were ready for the study. Phase one was needs assessment, where once again, we wanted to understand what are they doing right now with the infographics. So for that, we recruited participants from public health departments in the Northwest. And we conducted both an online survey and interviews with 21 and 11 participants respectively. And we asked them about the use of infographics. For example, do you use an existing infographic or do you create your own? And who is your target audience? What type of topics do you include? Then we talked about their infographic creation workflow if they created an infographic in the past. For example, what tools do you use? How much time do you spend? What type of resources would be useful? And then we also talked about some desired infographic tools, like what type of features they would want to see. And after that, we did an axial iterative interview coding, resulting in some themes. So first theme is that most participants create their own infographics, but public health professionals in general had little design experience. So these were kind of odd, right? You don't have the design experience, but you create your own. So we're like, okay, why, right? Why are they not creating or not using an existing infographic if that would be much easier? So a participant answered, and this was the general reasoning, was to personalize infographics to the target audience or the area that they were serving rather than having national data points. It's not very compelling if I shared national level data with my area's elected officials board. So we actually got two insights from these quotes. So one is that their target audience, we often think, well, these are public health infographics, so it's the public that they're presenting this to. But we also found that they often present infographics to policymakers or maybe head of their departments as well. The next is targeting or tailoring these infographic is very important to them, right? So they want to make the infographic specific to the local audience. And to do that, they wanted resources to help with the tailoring, such as icons and images. So a lot of people talked about finding these images. For example, participant 6 said, to communicate local data, we try to incorporate local images. We are a fishing community that lives near the ocean, so we try to incorporate a lot of those types of visuals, whether it's in the graphs or in the background. Another person said, right, if I'm trying to target farmers and all the illustrations on the infographic are showing people in suits, that's not gonna resonate with them. So they wanted the illustrations to represent their target audience, both in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, and even occupation. Another participant said, it's really difficult to find the right picture when you're trying to communicate risk in a colorful way without being too colorful or insensitive. So actually a prior research on infographic found that you needed some color to make it engaging, but making it too colorful made it seem childish and unprofessional. So you have to walk this fine line between being engaging, but not being too colorful. So they were really struggling with that, like how much is enough? Another thing that they pointed out is, for example, a lot of their patients might have, or people that they're targeting might have phobia of needles. So that meant that they can't use this icon of a syringe. So they had to be mindful of those kind of elements as well. So the next theme was that most of the people that we interviewed and surveyed used general graphic design tools to make infographics, such as Canva or PictoChart. And actually, many of them used PowerPoint to create infographics. And that was very time consuming and also very surprising to me, because I would never think that that would be a tool to create infographic. That meant that they actually had to create with their own template, find out what colors to use, the layout. There are so many design decisions that they had to make. So overall, they found it pretty difficult to, and very time consuming to create infographics given the current tools. And they desired a tool that would enable design flexibility and to reduce design decisions. Once again, they didn't want to decide, do I want this shade of red or that shade of red, right? They just wanted the tool to let them know which color to use or which color palette. At the same time, one participant said, I found myself almost finishing a project and then realizing I can't change one particular element that was critical to conveying the message. So they still wanted some flexibility in the design. And what was really hard was the existing tools either gave them too much flexibility that they didn't know how to handle all that design decisions, or it was a standard template. Oftentimes it's just a PDF, so you can change the numbers for the statistics, but you can't change anything else, right? It's basically ingrained into the PDF file. So after gathering all this, we set to phase 2, which was creating Florence, which was the public health infographic web tool that we created. And some of the design guidelines that we used was the tool layout should be familiar to users. Adding and modifying data in visualization should be quick and intuitive. Visual elements should be health focused. And maybe some of that sounds pretty obvious or intuitive. You'll be surprised at what the existing tools were doing. So I'm actually going to show you a video of what the progress looks like right now, and then compare it with the tool that we created. But just to give you a quick preview of how we try to implement this design guideline. One of it was that changing or entering data should be quick and intuitive. So what a lot of the existing design tools are doing right now is, regardless of what type of data visualization you want to create, they give you the same spreadsheet look. And you have to figure out what data do I enter where, and how do they fit together to come up with this data visualization. And it's good in a sense that it's consistent, right? And once you get familiar, it can be done quite quickly. But we found out that it could be quite hard on the first try. And once again, you'll see that in the demo video. So what we did was we actually had a separate input method for each type of data visualization. And that actually meant that we couldn't support as many graph types as these other ones. But remember, we did the survey of what type of infographics are out there. We also collected what type of data visualizations that they were using. So we supported the most frequently occurring types. Another thing that we wanted to do was make sure that when you updated the illustration part, right? So you updated a number, oftentimes there is a label associated with it. So we wanted to make sure that these two were showing the same data points. So whenever you updated one, it would actually reflect on the other element. So this text element or the qualitative element was tied to the data visualization. So with all of that, we went into phase 3, which was evaluating the tool or Florence in feasibility and usability. So once again, we recruited participants from public health departments in the Pacific Northwest, And we first did a feasibility study with 8 participants where we showed them a prototype of the tool. So it was not fully functioning, but it had the general look and the general features. And we asked them, is that something that you think would be useful in your work? And how would you incorporate that in your existing workflow? So we got the general feedback there, and then we revised the tool, and then we did a usability study with 19 participants, where we gave them the same set of tasks to perform on Florence and a picture chart, which is an existing web tool that they were using. And then and half of them started on Florence, half of them started on picture charts to make sure that order didn't have an effect on the results. And then we interviewed them on their experience. And then we had an anonymous post-survey system usability questionnaire. And once again, after all of that, we analyzed the data using Excel iterative coding to identify the strength and the weakness of our tool, Florence. So the quick summary of the finding is that people found Florence to be easy to use, where 1 is easy to use, 5 is difficult to use. It had 1.75, and it was useful, where 1 is not useful, 5 is extremely useful, and it got 4.6. So on both aspects, it got better scores compared to the tool that we were comparing it to. To dive into the specific strengths and weaknesses, they named having a toolkit of relevant health-related visual elements, having a simple and intuitive user interface, and the data entry method as the main strength of Florence. On the other hand, they named limited design features and less visually appealing UI as the weakness. So we could definitely improve on the looks, right? That was something that if we had time, we could improve. But what's interesting is these are kind of in conflict. Right? Or once you want to create a simple, right, and intuitive design, we have to choose which design features to make prominent, right? So it was kind of a trade-off. We knew that going in, but we decided, given their design knowledge and given their technical background, it would actually be better to go with the simple user interface rather than everything in one toolkit kind of look. So here is a video of an actual participant session. I did kind of like crop parts so that it could fit in 2 minutes or so, but you'll see them doing a task where they're updating some of the values first on Florence, and then they try the same task on the other tool. Here, see that. Oh, and what we did was we gave them a template that they started out with, and we give them a data sheet. So we said, this is your local data. Could you modify the infographic to tailor it to this data set? So you see, as they are entering the data, it updates both the labels and the data visualization because they're linked. And also we wanted to see if this type of input method matched their conceptual model of how they would create an icon array. So they could just have the numerator and a denominator. So it's 9 out of 10. Right? So it kind of matched their model of how they would enter those numbers. And you could also change the color and the size. So they had some design flexibility as they were doing this. So overall, they did the task pretty quickly. We compared the time that it took for both tools as well. People almost performed like in half the time that they did with the other tool. So here's the other tool, and you'll see it looks pretty straightforward, right? You would just change the data there, and you see black 28 and white 42, and the graph does change accordingly. And when they apply, you see that the visualization has changed. But what's different is that the labels are still the same. They haven't been updated because they're separate in the existing web tools. Right? So you have to first change the graph element, and then you have to change the text element. First problem, they're confused, right? They're like, what's going on? I thought I changed things. So they go back and forth between, the data entrance and the infographic, and they finally notice, okay, I have to do this myself. So it's kind of time consuming because you have to do it twice, right? I'm going to come back to this because a problem is that some of our participants didn't even notice that the labels hadn't updated. So they're like, oh, it looks good, and they moved on. So the text was actually not matching their visualization, which is a big problem. So I'll come back to this point. But here's another interesting thing. They, once again, had to make it 9 out of 10. So once again, they thought, okay, 9 out of 10, I would do 9 and I would do 10. But that's not how the tool works. Can you figure out what's going on? There's 19. Yeah, exactly. The top number is just one color. The bottom number is one color. But it's a little easier when there are only like 19 figures. But imagine if it's a big number, they don't count. So sometimes they were like really confused. And they would spend long time on this space. And for a couple of them, we actually have to give out the answer, like how they would do it. We would explain, right? The top part is a separate color, bottom part is a separate color. They're like, what? They're making me do mental math. I have to subtract, right? Once again, if it's 9 out of 10, it's not too bad because you enter 9 and 1. But imagine if the one of the number is like 34, then you would have to calculate the difference in your head. Okay. So going back to the mismatch between the visualization and text labels, imagine that they failed to notice until the very end, and they actually published this infographic, which has mismatching label and data visualization. People could take it in 2 different ways. First, they notice it, and it's bad because it decreases the trust in the information in the infographic. And even worse, it could actually decrease their trust in the organization that is publishing it, right? So the source itself. On the other hand, let's say people don't notice it, right? That's also still problematic because they're getting data, maybe they're reading the label, and they're not getting the correct information at that point. So either way, it's pretty problematic. So it's really important to make sure that the visual elements are matching the text. And I'm going to sidetrack just a little bit because that is exactly what I studied in one of my other research projects, which was what happens if there is a mismatch between the title and the visualization. So what we did is we selected 2 visualizations. This is one of it. And you'll see that it's actually presenting the same data in 2 different manners. So this was showing the number of Syrian refugees accepted by different countries. And it would show it as absolute number on the left and relative number on the right, meaning share of host population. So if you focused on the absolute number, we could say US has accepted more Syrian refugees than the UK, Italy, Russia, and Finland combined. Because yes, it accepted 16K. So it was more than some of these other countries. But if you looked at the relative number, it was 0.005% of the host population. So not too big compared to the other population. So hopefully you see how it's kind of telling 2 different stories, right? Although the data is the same. So the title is focusing on one aspect of that visualization, the absolute number. So what we did was we tried to say, hey, what if the visual emphasis is on the other side, the relative value, right? Or what happens if we remove the absolute value altogether? So now there's a big mismatch between what the title is saying and what the visualization is showing, because it's not true, right? Would people figure this out? So what we did was we showed this information and we asked participants, do you think the information on this is very biased, somewhat biased, or neutral? What do you think people answered? Biased? I hope so, right? That's our hope. But what we found was majority of them said neutral. There's a very strong trust once you see data. Once again, quantitative data, numbers, it sounds like a fact, right? So in fact, when we asked them, why would you rate it as neutral? They said things like, it's fact. How can it be biased? Numbers do not lie. The graph is what it is. The information is not telling us what to do or what to think. It's just listing facts. Okay, so there's an inherent trust when it comes to data and also data visualization. At the same time, we asked them, okay, then what do you think is the main message of this visualization? Okay, and majority of them, or actually many of them, answered okay, US accepted more refugees. They go with the title, right? So it's very odd that it's the quantitative element that they are trusting, but it's the qualitative element that they're taking away. Okay, so we really have to be mindful of how they play together. So here's an example coming back to public health infographic. Let's say we have this infographic on childhood obesity, and it has some statistical facts, icons, cute illustrations, etc. There are many ways that we can name it or give a title to it. For example, we can just do the topic, obesity in infants, obesity in America, pretty neutral. Or we can do a question approach, like what is the current state of obesity in America? Or the fear approach, obesity, an epidemic in the US. Or more hopeful approach, obesity, complex but conquerable. And then the call for action approach, be healthy, not heavy. Okay. And depending on how you name it or what title you assign to it, even though the infographic stays the same, I predict that the way they perceive and interpret this infographic is going to be different. So that's my first study on public health infographics. My next study or set of studies looked at visualizing behaviors during autism pre-screening sessions. And first, to motivate this work, miscommunication in clinical settings can lead to a lower quality of treatment, patient dissatisfaction, and even medical lawsuits. In fact, the majority of complaints that patients make is about communication, not the quality of treatment, which can be pretty surprising. So communication is important. And what we did was our project focused on visualizing behaviors during an autism pre-screening session called a rapid ABC, rapid attention back and forth communication test. It's not a full diagnostic test, so you can't diagnose a child based on it, but it was enough to flag those children that might have developmental delays. And it consisted of 5 stages of social play, greeting, rolling a ball, reading a book, wearing the book as a hat, and tickling. And for each phase, we had one or more examiner bits. For example, look at my book. And you're trying to solicit certain social behavior from the child. So hopefully you say, look at the book, and they look at the book, or you say, roll the ball, and then they would roll, and so forth. Okay. So after doing the session, we hand-coded each video in 3 modalities, speech, gaze, and gesture. And then we came up with different methods to visualize it. I'm gonna skip the process of evaluating that and go straight into the tools that came out of that process for the sake of time. We had 2 different web tools as a result, Plexlines and Engage. And for this talk, I'm mainly going to focus on Engage once again, because we don't have enough time for both. So I'll quickly go over how to interpret Engage later on. But to get started, we conducted 4 different studies assessing the web tools. And I'm going to focus on the last one, parent and clinician interviews on Plexlines and Engage, because that focused on the communication role of these visualizations, while the other 3 also contained a diagnostic feature. So they actually asked the clinicians, how useful would it be to diagnose the child, and etc. We didn't do that for the fourth study. So for that study, I interviewed 10 parents from local preschool and kindergarten. The inclusion criteria was their child must be between 0 and 5 years old, showing signs of developmental delays, but not officially diagnosed yet. So what we did is we had the parent come into a session with their child. We actually conducted the study at their school, so it's the parent who was joining. And then after the rapid ABC session, the parent returned and they explored both of the visualization web tools, and then we interviewed them about their experience at the end. We also did a similar study with clinicians. So I interviewed 13 clinicians at a children's hospital. They had an average of 17 years of experience working with children with developmental delays, and they had various occupations. And once again, they looked at the web tools and then we interviewed them at the end. So here's an example of what the web tool might look like. And this is Engage. So we have the three modalities. We have gaze in blue at the top, vocalization in red in the middle, and then gesture in green at the bottom. And you'll see for gaze and vocalization, there are actually two rows. One is for the child, one is for the examiner, and so forth. So this would be looking at examiner's vocalization, child's vocalization, and so forth. So with that, we could actually filter for specific things. Dark blue meant that either the examiner is looking at the child or the child is looking at the examiner. So we could check for maybe eye contact or how many times the child looks at the examiner. We could also filter for things like the examiner's bits or gesture when they're pointing, etc. So they could explore the data for around 5 minutes. And we found lots of things that it could do, but I'll be presenting 3 of the uses for this, especially for communication. So as a disclaimer, this quote has nothing to do with this picture. I just wanted to show you how like the mapping might look like, right? So you would have a video that's playing, and then you would see this timeline kind of move along to show where we are at in that video. And for example, the light blue over there shows when the child is looking at the ball, and the dark blue shows when the child is looking at the examiner. So you can see back and forth, meaning the child is looking at the ball, then the examiner, and so forth. Okay. So with that, a clinician said most standardized tests are normed towards children with typically developing social skills. They're not normed for children with autism. So standardized tests often don't show as much progress. I can see this being very useful tool to document progress. Like this is where we were before, and this is where they are now. This many more times they pointed and vocalized. And that's because InGaze was very good at showing micro behaviors or behaviors that occur for a fraction of a second. So even though the child looked at the examiner really quickly, maybe that dark blue circle over there, it's not so visible in the video, but they can see it in the visualization. Okay. Another parent actually said, this is so useful because right now what I'm getting is one number for my child. They say, your child is a 3. What does that mean, right? I don't really understand. They're saying that he's not up to his peers, but I want to know what 3 means. I also want to know why he got a 3, right? So she didn't get any of that information from the current system, but she said, if I had something like that, that would make me understand the data a lot better. Next, on sharing data while preserving privacy. We asked parents, how comfortable would you be in sharing this visualization in situations where you wouldn't share the original video? And majority of parents said that they are very comfortable sharing the visualization because it's an abstract form of the session when they wouldn't share the original video. And this is actually really helpful for health communication because there are oftentimes situations where clinicians want to share the video or some type of data, but they can't because of HIPAA, which sets laws against sharing medical information without permission. And we found out that this was actually prevalent, especially in foster care settings, because foster care parents didn't have the right to see the videos. So they were like, oh, this would be great to show this abstracted version of the session. And lastly, clinicians said that this would be useful to serve as an objective evidence. So oftentimes they would talk with the parent, and sometimes they would have to break the bad news, right? Your child has autism. And oftentimes, understandably, parents are in denial. They say, no, but my child is good at responding to his name, or my daughter has good eye contact, right? So they would give these explanations on why that's not true, and it's only your perception of my child. You haven't spent enough time with my child, right? So a clinician said, if I say they don't have eye contact, they don't look at me, that's something subjective. But this visualization is not. See how many times that it didn't happen? I think parents would be more open to this most of the time. If you take that person out of it, it's harder to argue against data than another person. So once again, we got kind of similar theme from both clinicians and parents. this inherent idea of trust once you see a visualization, it's hard to argue, right? If you see that the child over there never has a dark blue strip, meaning that child never looked at the examiner during the session. So it's really hard to say, hey, my child is making eye contact when it's pretty obvious in the visualization that they're not doing that. So with that, I'm going to move on to my ongoing and future work. I actually have multiple projects going on, and thank you, my students, for working on those. So they all involve data visualization. One of it was on onboarding. So how can you create tutorial or onboarding for visualization? Because oftentimes UX designers want to incorporate more complex visualization into a dashboard, but they don't know the visualization design. So we're teaching them how to either design or understand visualization and exploring which technique is the best at doing that. The next one is we're looking at how visualizations are used in research articles or presentations. So we're seeing, especially HCI researcher, because I'm from HCI. So we're focusing on how do HCI research articles present their data. And then also data visualization, the role in health chatbots. And lastly, we're looking at how can we use visualization for qualitative data analysis. So for the remainder, I'll be focusing on the last topic. First, I want to talk about the qualitative data analysis process, because I think we have some folks here who are not coming from this qualitative research background. So very brief explanation is usually we conduct an interview and it's either video or audio recorded. Then we transcribe it into text. So we start out with this long text transcriptions. We group them into themes, we develop the codes, and then we find excerpts in the transcripts that fit the code. Now, analyzing interviews using text transcripts has limitations. So I'm going to talk about 3 of the challenges that we have. One is that we have a large volume of data. In fact, if you have, say, a 30-minute focus group or a 1 hour of interview, if your participant is very talkative, then you can have up to like 30 pages of text transcript. So imagine you have to read that over and over again to find the themes and find the codes. And it is quite time-consuming and also cognitively burdensome, so you might end up missing some of the insights. The next is subjective judgment. So although hopefully researchers try to be as neutral as possible when we start the coding, we still have our personal biases, our personal beliefs. And they saw that we have confirmation bias when we're coding. So if you think hypothesis A is true, you're more likely to find that theme as you're coding compared to theme that opposes your prior beliefs. And lastly, underutilization of multimodal data, meaning you collected all this audio and video information, but you never use it. And a big downside of that is you miss all of these non-verbal cues. Maybe the participant sighed, right, before saying something, or maybe they look confused. You're not getting that if you only look at the text transcript. So in order to address these problems, we're in the phase of developing and analyzing or evaluating ChromaScribe, which is a visualization web tool for qualitative data analysis. And we're trying to incorporate 3 different elements. One is human-in-the-loop text analysis or text analysis system. So what we're doing is we're feeding the transcript into the tool. And right now we just have a very basic natural language processing algorithm that tries to find some common themes. And it's human in the loop because we're showing that back to the researcher and they can modify it as they see fit. Hopefully we can kind of make this process more objective because they're seeing what the machine would code it as, and they could either fix it if they see something is wrong. Next, we are visualizing the themes. So here is sample visualization. You might notice it's actually very similar to Engage because I was familiar with Engage. I'm like, oh, this would work great. right? So we have the interviewer data at the top and the interviewee data at the bottom. And we saw it's actually great for showing a summary of an interview session. In fact, when we were demonstrating this with a nursing faculty who gave us the sample data, he mentioned something like, oh, I thought this theme of stigma was very prevalent in the interview. But actually, now looking over it, it only appeared once, but that person was very passionate while talking about it. So I thought it was a much bigger theme than it actually is, now that I see a summary. And lastly, we want to incorporate a visual summary of audio data. And this is where we can really use some feedback and help, because right now we're doing very basic thing, like we're visualizing amplitude and pitch. But what we're kind of finding out through some trial runs is it's not very informative, right? Just to know how loudly they spoke or how high or low their pitch was. So we have to find either a better way of visualizing that data or be able to extract some other nonverbal information. So in order to kind of find out what do people want to see, especially when nonverbal communication is concerned, we're doing, or we're about to do a focus group. I think they're actually starting next week or so. So after getting some feedback from the focus group, we'll be redesigning ChromaScribe hopefully over the summer. And then we'll do a usability testing of the tool. And lastly, we're planning to do a field study where we compare how the same transcript or set of transcripts are analyzed using our tool and an existing qualitative data analysis tool. So the main goal of this research project is to create a transparent and trustworthy data analysis process. Because a lot of the times when we're analyzing it, like myself, I don't know if I'm biased or neutral when I'm doing it. And also it takes time to go back and check the data. So hopefully this makes it a little easier to do that. And also in the presentation of qualitative data analysis, here's a pretty typical way of presenting the summary of the qualitative data analysis, where you have the main themes, right? And then you have the number of participants or percentage of people who mentioned the theme. You have a detailed description of the theme. You also have some sample quotes for the theme, but that's just about it. Okay, so there's only so much you can convey in a paper for qualitative data. So I'm hoping that you would be able to share a visual summary so people can see the details of it. And maybe people can even filter by their demographic, maybe by their age or expertise, right? Who is more likely to come up with certain theme? So hopefully through that, we will get a more transparent qualitative data presentation as well. To wrap up, I presented 3 of my previous and ongoing studies: infographics of public health, visualization web tools for clinical communication, and visualization web tool for qualitative data analysis. I hope I encouraged you, or the takeaway is to deliberate on the interplay between quantitative and qualitative elements when creating an infographic or visualization. Consider the elements of trust and bias in data visualization. And also, I'm advocating for further exploration on ways to visualize qualitative data. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions at this time. Yeah.
I have a question and a comment. I don't know if you want to go back to slide 23 or not. It was there's where my question started forming. It was, I think, the research related to the high papers that you had.
23.
Yes. Yeah. And I was just sort of thinking about, I guess the finding, the take-home message from that work is that there is a lot of trust in the numbers. And I was wondering, did you look into demographic details specifically? So I'm thinking like educational background or careers. So I can imagine, depending on what training or pre-knowledge someone might have, they may come at it with a bit more like skepticism.
Yeah.
So like, I'm just wondering, like, what sort of demographic would your participants?
Definitely. We actually did look into some demographic factors and we also looked at their visual literacy, but none of them were really strongly related, which is kind of surprising. But at the same time, I actually did pilot study with a bunch of my PhD student colleagues, and almost everyone said it was neutral. One disclaimer is we actually had a first study where we did show both sides. So that's when more people said it was neutral. Once we took out one message, there was a higher percentage of people who said that it was biased, but the majority was still that it was neutral. So there's some awareness once you take it to the extreme. But if you just presented both messages, then a lot of people would still say it's neutral, even if they have really high education level.
And then my comment was about the accessibility.
Oh, okay.
I think that I often see a lot of kind of poor design choices in infographics from an accessibility perspective, like maybe low contrasting colors or color combinations. You mentioned the professional, the healthcare people. A lot of them, I guess, are novice designers in that way. So I think that there might be more research in that space that you could maybe start to explore. That's also like what are the common kind of accessibility issues within infographics, and then also potentially, I guess, addressing that by maybe like you're creating the tools to help guide people make better infographics. Potentially there could be some guidance there in also making good decisions for making more accessible designs.
Yeah, definitely. Once we have more information, it'd be great to kind of incorporate those accessibility guidelines into the tool itself, so they don't have to worry about it as much.
That's
Thanks for the,
interesting.
thank you.
I have a question on the visualization tool or the infographic making tool. When the person changed it was 2 out of 4, and they're changing it to 10. Could you go to that slide?
I think it was this.
Yeah, this is the one before.
Oh, yeah, this is our tool. So I think I have to jump to here.
Yeah, how do they change? So they changed it to the 9 out of 10. How do they change where it says only half of women?
So, okay, so I did, now that I have time, I can kind of explain. So we could have embedded as 9 out of 10 as text, but because this is written in words, we didn't really like link these two. So this was an instance where they had to go back and they did have to update the text. But it would be very easy to actually link it if we were to just do 9 out of 10.
I was just curious how they can change it.
Yeah, so they would be able to actually, I don't think I have this version, but once you create a visualization, you can actually create a text element that's linked to it. So you would do that and you would just like have the position.
I apologize if you already explained this at the beginning, but how was the decision made to use infographics to convey the public health messages rather than videos or narrative or something else? And then kind of related to that, did you look at like the effectiveness of Florence for how well the resulting infographics conveyed the public health message?
So the second question, no, we didn't do an evaluation at the end. I'm trying to remember. No, I don't think we did any assessment of the resulting infographic, although that could be a future study. The reason why we did infographic was actually public health professionals asked for it. So before I joined it, the purpose of the project was to give them tools to analyze the data. But then a lot of the professionals said, okay, we've analyzed it, but now what? We want to create infographics. Could you maybe find a collaborator who could do that? So then they brought me on board and that's how I got started. So yeah, I didn't have like a research fundamental for that decision. It was really practical side of it.
So they just decided like that would be the best way for them to convey.
Yeah, they wanted, I think because they saw a lot of those on social media and well, after that, I actually did a research survey on the effectiveness of health infographics. And we did find that it was effective, but it was kind of after we had created this tool.
So for the qualitative analysis, I think it's really interesting. I think now there's a lot more like AI tools that can do some of that. So how do you plan to sort of separate that out from visualization as a boost to the analysis?
Yeah, definitely. So we are considering that, and of course, like when I proposed it, we didn't have a lot of this like generative AI out there. So that definitely changed things. But I think one of the thing is how interactive and how interpretable the resulting things are. So a lot of the times now, there are some tools that are doing the automated theme generation, but afterward, you still have to go through and read every excerpt to check if it's true. Now, let's say that hopefully, right, we do a similar type of automated approach, but now the resulting thing is something like this. So if you decide, I want to check if it accurately coded a specific theme, you could just click and you can check the transcript and you can quickly modify. So I think the visualization is more useful for the human in the loop part now. So,
Yeah.
okay, thanks.
I might ask one very quick question and then I think that'll take us to the time. I was wondering, like, I guess it depends who you maybe talk to about Scribe. I feel like there's definitely a subgroup of qualitative researchers that really try and avoid quantifying things. And you had an example of like with the, I guess codes and but like percentage of how many. When I write my papers, I guess it depends who I'm collaborating with. I'll not always do that. I know that sometimes other people will try and avoid like X number of people said this. I'm just wondering if you've kind of thought about that, or if you've had conversations with people who kind of do that approach and what they like.
Yeah, so we actually did have that conversation come up. And what was interesting is we had not quite pilot studies, but we had like semi-interviews just to see if people would use it. And we got like two opposite messages where one qualitative researcher was like, this is great, but we also want a quantitative summary of everything. And then we had the other researcher who was kind of coming from the field that you're mentioning, is like, she didn't even want to see like these quantitative like summaries. She's like, okay, I'm fine with themes being displayed because I mean, they are coded as such, but you should remove like all the quantitative elements. So I think maybe like having more like customization part where you could incorporate more quantitative element or data analytic type of features versus like maybe we support various thematic tools.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
I think with that, if we give Hidy another round of applause and we'll stop the recording.